And then when the sort of conditions of the pandemic started, we started talking to each other, and we were like, well, we had a lot of things going on, and there was a lot of discussion going across people, and so we sort of decided that we were going to try and reflect that in the blog. So over the course of the lockdown, I think we put out, it was about 30 COVID-specific pieces that we either drafted ourselves, or there was a massive sort of upsurge in submissions from people within the field, which was fantastic. So we're kind of having a conversation amongst ourselves now as to what we do with that body of work. And it's a substantial body of work. I think part of the issue was really, well, for me, I can't speak for the others, but for me, it was about I felt a need to kind of try and document what was going on in some way, in a sociological way, in terms of, these are unprecedented, unheralded times, and it was really interesting to try and think through some of the sociological implications, as well as the more immediate stuff that went on. So, yeah, I just say, if you haven't had a chance to look at it, there's a whole host of a plethora of COVID. We had a pandemic of COVID blog pieces on the site, so please do have a look.
Thanks, Ewen. So we'll just start the general discussion, and just bear in mind that none of us have really done anything like this before, so bear with us if there are some sort of loud changes of gear and pauses and things like that. So we're going to start off by talking about politics and COVID. And so the COVID crisis unfortunately arrived and coincided with a post-truth moment in politics, which has been around in the UK ever since the Brexit campaign, where there were certain sections of the political establishment that started arguing that facts don't matter anymore, and that empirical verification is actually an enemy of the people. And the current government, led by Johnson and Cummings, seems to have an animosity to expertise and evidence. And they surround themselves with shallow, incompetent radicals. And they basically lie about everything. They lie about PPE, about care homes, about herd immunity, about test and trace, about statistics. And something which has been probably a catastrophic COVID response, we've got one of the worst excess death rates in the world, is then rebranded as something that's world-beating. So Ewen, you've recently written a paper on populism and health. So does that shed any light on this lot and how they've responded and mismanaged the crisis?
I think it does. I think the what's been interesting for me from that perspective is the sort of the push to try and transform this from being a sort of public health crisis into an economic crisis, and where you place primacy. And there's been a real push to make the economics of primary importance much more so than the public health context. But what is interesting for me in terms of populism then is that populism and public health become quite incompatible when we're talking about a pandemic such as this, because you can't just identify a nativist group within the population who need to be given access to healthcare, because the virus will spread through all those other people that aren't given that access. So in that sense, this sort of pandemic speaks against that populist nativist component. But then the economic doesn't necessarily. So there's some, there's really interesting stuff going on in terms of that back and forth between which has primacy. Is it primarily an economic issue, or is it primarily a public health issue? And for me, it's still primarily a public health issue. And we're maybe about to see that resurgence of the public health focus again if we're looking at another lockdown, which I think looks to be increasingly likely given the way that things are going. But yeah, there's interesting tensions there.
Yeah, thanks, Ewen. So I mean, I think that's something you highlight quite well, which is that there seems to be a tension there between either health or wealth, and the government seems to be failing actually on both counts in a lot of ways. They're not really.
They've been held to account for the health failings, but they've not really been held to account for the economic failings. Maybe because they haven't become as immediately apparent as the health failings are.
Yeah. So, did anyone else got anything to say about the type of health and wealth angle of how the COVID response is going? Or shall we move on to talking about something else about the politics of what's going on? And I mean, I suppose one of the key.
Charlie's there, Simon.
Sorry. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Charlie.
Simon, I think that in some ways the health or wealth dichotomy, the idea that you can either have a set of collective policies and collective actions which aim at maximizing health, or you can have a set of policies which aim at maximizing the maintenance of your previous and pre-existing economic structures, right? And so I think that in some ways that's quite, that's a relatively crude dichotomy, I think, because if you introduce just a simple concept that medical social sciences have been kind of talking about and interested in for many, many decades, which is a more generalized idea of well-being, well, then of course the two fields begin to merge together, and that you realize that, that any set of policies or any set of collective actions, because of course they may not be policies, they may be things that people themselves do voluntarily in the absence of a law or in the absence of a set of regulations. But if you do things which bring economic activity to a much lower level, then that has knock-on effect, obviously, to the personal well-being, the physical well-being, and the emotional well-being of all sorts of members of the community. So in some ways, I found it very frustrating from the beginning, what I feel to be a slightly crude distinction between, the idea that the government's only interested in the economy, they're trying to maximize wealth, they're trying to maximize the return for shareholders, or the idea that a responsible government would say the economy can go to hell in a handcart because we've got to save lives. I do think that there's a more interesting middle area in there. And one of the things I find frustrating is that a lot of the arguments in that middle area have been left to the libertarian right wing to pursue, and that people on the liberal left have tended to pin all their colours to the mast of public health action. And I've personally found that a bit frustrating.
Catherine?
Yeah, just thinking historically, like the argument that government should preserve health has been used as a cover of growing government, hasn't it? That is part of the foundation of the Western European nation state, is saying we're going to protect health, and it starts with managing epidemics and infectious disease, and it grows the state around those functions, starting with policing and hospitals. But you don't want to ignore that and pile in behind the defence of health as the overriding concern if we know that health has been the cover for growing government and discipline, Foucault, right, for a very long time. So we need to be a bit careful about accepting the dichotomy, as Charlie says, and remembering the history as well as the uses that other people can make of that dichotomy.
Chris, Yuill?
Oh, yeah, just following on a little bit from what Catherine was saying about historical stuff. It's interesting, looking back at various other pandemics and plagues, these arguments have been rehearsed before. Like during the Black Death, the Italian mercantile class was very opposed to cities being put in quarantine. They were against it, no. And I think, it's something that always comes up there. And I think the two of them are actually quite interwoven. Often like pandemics and the pursuit of wealth and money are part and parcel of the same thing. If you look at the origins of the current pandemic, it was the expansion of global capitalism that has forced people to move into parts of rural China where they encounter, animal hosts of the virus and allows the transmission that way. If you look at other kind of pandemics in the past, or plagues, like for example, the Spanish went into South America and they spread various European illnesses through the populations of the Incas and so on and so forth. So the two always go together. I don't think there's a separation between the two. And it's something now about maybe start talking about biocapitalism, or we could throw together words like that. That always sound impressive. But I think there's something in that deeper historical kind of view there.
Right.
I don't know if I'm just being difficult, but I think there's sort of two aspects of like dichotomy. One, which is right, where Charlie, you're saying that it should be blurred because actually health and wealth aren't separate like notions. But then there's also the practical engagement of both of those things, where it is a dichotomy because it's health as a concept, like Catherine said, as a model for control, and then the wealth of a very particular number of people through very particular channels. Like if you look at it in that way, rather than our general health and our general wealth, which do coincide, like we all know that there's loads of negative health outcomes associated with lack of work or poor working conditions, but there's that like it's how they're being set up. So we talk about them like it's everyone's health and everyone's wealth. But what actually is happening is we're talking about health as a means of control and wealth of specific people who can always get wealthier no matter what the material circumstances of everyone else. Like the people who are getting rich off the back of COVID-19 are the people who are getting rich anyway. And they're neither making a profit from it nor making a loss, if that makes sense, because the profit would be there anyway. And so I don't know, I think there is, and actually sometimes the dichotomy is helpful if we're being critical of those channels, but not helpful if we're talking about us as a collective people that want to stay alive, as it were, if that makes sense.
Yeah. I think moving this on slightly, one of the other things that emerged I suppose in the broad political sphere of COVID is the weird conspiracies that arose from COVID, whether it's the 5G masks or people's animosity to Bill Gates for some type of computer they were using about 15 years ago, which is now spread into being the general conspiracy about Bill Gates trying to take over the world via vaccines, or the very incredibly weird culture wars waged by the libertarian right on mask wearing. So I just wondered if anyone's got any. I think Christopher Till, you've been doing some work on conspiracies. So is there anything you want to say about the weird conspiracies that have been emerging from COVID?
Yeah, well, I think this relates to the first point actually about the lies, the lying that we kind of started out with, and I think I've been thinking about this recently, and I think that Johnson's always kind of lied, and as lots of politicians do, and I think that it's not necessarily in this kind of context of conspiracy theories and of sort of notions of fake news and that kind of thing. I don't think the fact that he lies is necessarily politically a problem. And I think for certain sectors of the electorate or of the society, whether that's here and in other countries, particularly in America, it doesn't necessarily matter that he's lying as long as he's my liar, and it's like that he's standing in up for me. But I think it does have a problem. That's politically, but I think in this context of COVID and a pandemic, I think it does, because I think that is related to these kinds of conspiracy theories, culture wars, and actually to adherence to the trying to improve the health situation, because I think perhaps one of the things which lies underneath that is notions of trust. And I think so even perhaps a lot of the supporters of people like Johnson probably wouldn't trust him in a fundamental sense. They just think he's aligned with them, perhaps. And there's been lots of things from recently around, we can kind of look at different countries in terms of their sort of perceived overall levels of trust. And it seems like the high trust countries have had more harsh lockdowns. It's been presumed because the people can't be trusted to follow the rules. The more high trust countries have had less stringency, Sweden being one of the top ranked for trust in terms of trust in the wider community and trust in governments and trust in like the health services and health professions. So I think that there's a kind of an underlying kind of damage that's being done there, or connection as well. And I think that again, this relates to the kind of the anti-vaccination, anti-mask kind of groups in some ways. And we know that, for instance, that studies have shown fake news spreads quicker, particularly through Twitter, than through news. But also that people are more, people within those kinds of conspiracy theory groups are better at making connections with others, and they're better at spreading them. And so there's a kind of, I think that there's a mixture of a kind of a more general aspect of social relations in trust, which Georg Simmel said was like a kind of almost a pre-societal thing. We need it for society to exist. We need a certain level of trust, but also a lot of strategy going on as well, and strategic intervention from some groups, not in a necessarily in a kind of an overriding conspiracy or in a centralized way, but people are trying to make things happen. And whether that is intervention from kind of foreign kind of states, or just within certain kinds of smaller groups. So I think there is this connection there, which has maybe not been explored enough.
Thanks, Chris. Has anyone got anything to add to that?
I just think to come back to the populist side of it, and if we, taking Chris's point, if we look at the states which have had the worst response, Bolsonaro in Brazil, Trump in the States, the UK, then again, there's a common thread there in terms of those, you know, you've got sort of right-wing populist leaders largely directing perhaps an ideological response to the pandemic rather than a public health or an economic one.
Right.
Yeah.
I
think that,
and then Charlie. Chris, go on.
Oh yeah, sure. Just a very quick point. Phil Strong's classic essay on epidemic psychology, which he deals with like the kind of social, I don't know why he calls it epidemic psychology, it's a bit of sociology, but he talks about one of the phases of, you know, any pandemic, there's the pandemic of explanation, where everybody kind of comes rushing in, you know, to try and fill that particular space, especially if it is, we're seeing in the moment, there's a kind of vacation of that space by experts. And I think it's quite interesting. We look at some how people have been treated, like Neil Ferguson, I keep thinking of that right-wing historical guy, but the professor of epidemiology, you know, sort of like got a complete monstering by the press for, you know, okay, he was wrong, but, you know, compare it to sort of like Cummings. And again, I think it's interesting what we're seeing here is a continuation of something that happened under Thatcher, going back to it, that diminution of the expert. You know, it's not just like Boris Johnson is a liar. He's doing this out of an ideological project, you know, sort of like experts get in the way of the market. They get in the way of the sovereign individual battling ahead and doing all the rest of it. I think it's just maybe just going to contextualize it a little bit like that. There's a historical root to why these things are coming around and why the experts have been placed in that way.
Okay. Charlie?
Yeah, no, I was just going to say that the kind of the relatively catch-all category of the idea of conspiracy theories, you know, then is a really interesting one in its own right, because of course it seems to me that at one end of the spectrum, then you've got the very kind of classic conspiratorial ideas that would be recognizable from all sorts of different fields previously in history. You know, that, for example, that this isn't a virus at all. It's an illness or a condition caused by something different. Let's say 5G masks or 5G radiation rather coming from these masks, and that the idea of it being a virus is entirely made up by some invisible, evil individual, invisible state or semi-state, dark state apparatus. Then you've got other ideas which it'd be quite easy to take in under the rubric or the heading of conspiracy theories, but I actually think that they're quite different, and that they're just kind of they're sets of ideas that run counter to what we might call an official narrative. So, for example, just to take, for example, what I blogged about towards the beginning of the pandemic on the cost of living site, about the idea that there's a very, very widespread belief that the COVID-19 illness and the coronavirus infection has actually been in the Western world for a lot longer than the official date of arrival, which is sometime around about just after Christmas 2019. And yet you don't have to go very far at all to find a lot of people who think, well, everyone at my workshop had it in November, or, you know, we think we had it before Christmas, or whatever it might. And therefore, there's a set of ideas which has a different narrative to what one might think of as the official narrative. Now, I think that people exchanging ideas about the fact that their work colleagues or their family had this illness several weeks before officially it was meant to be possible to have the illness, I actually think it's interesting to think of that as a slightly different type of theory than the idea that that Bill Gates has actually invented the virus and sent it around the world because he's Bill Gates. It seems to me that, you know, one idea is more, personally, I find it the idea that the illness had been around for a long time, and therefore the official narrative isn't true, I find that quite a respectable kind of discussion to be having. Whereas, has the illness been brought by two-headed lizards that come from Mars and that are working for Bill Gates, I wouldn't find that a particularly respectable thing as a social scientist to talk about.
Thanks, Karen. Yeah, go on, Catherine.
So that just seems to me to link to one of the interesting questions about the testing, because as we've gone through this, I keep expecting the antigen tests to help people do that kind of lay epidemiology. And I certainly, in discussions with colleagues and students, that's come up as like, well, I think I've had it, but I'll wait. And when I can get an antigen test, then I'll know. And then we'll act differently. You know, people are inventing for themselves that passport idea, but the complications of the antigen tests and what they mean now have really interrupted that possibility for people to pursue their lay understandings or their counter governmental understandings with claims to evidence from the antigen tests. And I keep expecting that to happen, but it looks like that's not, you know, at the moment it still has to be narrated as an experience and memory. It can't be linked back to biology.
Thanks, Catherine. I think that's quite an interesting point at which we could move on to the next section when you're mentioning antigen tests, because that would take us on to COVID and science. And interestingly, I know someone who I'm fairly sure did have COVID, and they went for an antigen test and it proved negative.
Yeah.
And so I think the antigen tests are quite flawed, but that maybe that would move on to the next section. I think Ewan's going to be chairing the next section on science. So do you want to say a few words before we get started on that, Ewan? And then
I think the most impressive thing is the way that we've so professionally segued from one section of the discussion into the next, almost as if with no pre-planning whatsoever. It's incredible. So I'd applaud everybody for that. Yeah, so I think that I mean, we've already touched on some of the issues about the ideas around science, about how science, you know, operates in a vacuum, whether there is a vacuum, you know, what the lay understandings of all these things are. And I guess, I don't know, the first thing might be, how do we make sense of this in terms of epidemiology or lay understandings, and then how do we think about that and how that relates up to the hard science end of things. So I don't know whether, Charlie, did you have something you wanted to say about sort of epidemiology and lay understandings of this stuff?
Yeah, I think you and I've obviously, you know, over the last few weeks and months done a lot of thinking about it, and it seems to me to be some of the situation that that we find ourselves in as kind of sociological and anthropological observers and you know, of the scene, and of course participants. We're all involved in this. You know, that we're in quite strangely familiar architectural territory in some ways. You know, that we have information which is often statistical information because we're dealing with a public health issue. So, for example, we have a lot of figures flying around that that a lot of people feel comfortable talking about, an unusual number of people feel comfortable talking about, you know, with discussions about R numbers taking place in all sorts of places where you might not expect there to be a discussion of a very specific technical epidemiological measurement. So everybody is kind of or a lot of people in the community are drinking in statistics and risk communication about the number of people per 100,000 that might have an illness at a particular time, and particularly about different risks that accrue to different groups within society, whether they're age groups or ethnic cultural groups or whatever it might be. So the familiar architectural territory that we're in, I think, is that there is a structural description largely driven by epidemiological statistics about risk and probability and possibility and the measures that people might be recommended or forced to take by the government. And then the individual is in the position of having to map their own lives onto that framework. And that's why I say architecturally, we know all about this area, because essentially at that abstract level, we're really in the same position as we are when we're talking about diabetes or cancer or heart disease, or, you know, the idea that we have the stats, the public health communication, and yet each individual person has got to weave their own life through that framework and come to their own micro decisions about it.
Yeah, okay, that's really interesting. Thank you. And then I don't know, Simon, did you want to? And then Catherine.
I think just following on from that, I think one of the weaving things that people are doing is that I think one of the things that this has exposed is that as medical sociologists and people working in the type of field of health sociology, we know that most diseases are messy. You know, in reality, they're messy. But there's an idea in general public discourse that maybe they aren't. We know that, you know, that we know what influenza is, we know how to treat it, we know what the response is, we know Whereas this I think is the COVID has exposed the whole messiness of the disease, but because definitely to start with, there were no fixed points. We didn't really know what the symptoms that people might be experiencing changed all the time. What were counted as official symptoms changed. Who was at risk changed. I mean, how that had played out. How people progressed through the disease. Some people got over it very quickly. Some people have very long COVID. Some people didn't survive. All these type of things exposed the messiness, and then on top of that was the whole policy response, which was itself messy and varied between countries, and then there were lots of debates about whether we should be doing what other countries are doing, or in local areas. So I think this has exposed the real messiness of a disease trajectory, which hasn't probably been exposed in that way before recently.
Catherine, yeah.
Yeah, and I think as well that so people keep saying we mustn't talk about the science, but it keeps slipping back in. And I think if you look at the politics of the advice to government, that was quite particular sciences. And we're not unusual as a discipline in feeling a bit locked out of that, actually. You know, virologists and public health people of different kinds have felt locked out of the ability to advise science, pushed out by certain sorts of evidence, like the mathematicians and the modelling and the disaster response people and those other trendy, you know, little sub areas. And I think when you think about what sense people have been making or how they've been trying to make sense with epidemiology, they've also been trying to make sense of the virology, of the behavior of the virus, right? To understand in everyday life how this virus is going to behave, and to understand for themselves what kinds of care they need to take for themselves and other people. So I was really fascinated when in working in mutual aid, and I'm sure lots of other people were doing that too, that at the very beginning, when we knew almost nothing about the virus, everyone was very, very cautious, and particularly elderly people were extremely cautious. And what we had to do is to try and work out what was a safe way to help someone who was self-isolating and too scared to look out the window, never mind open the door. And it was fascinating to me that we could call on people who understood viruses and how they worked. We could do that. We could try and argue from the bottom up. But it was actually also the kind of queer care networks who have a longer tradition of self-help with trans and with sexually transmitted diseases and countering fears about HIV and AIDS, who started off with really rigorous protocols, but, you know, actually grounded in some understanding of what was happening. And then we relaxed back from those as knowledge of the virus grew. But I think there was a lot of lay virology, I suppose, to counter the lay epidemiology of like, can I touch this? How long do I have to leave it? Do I need to wash the shopping? You know, that was the kind of conversation we were all having in March. And I know my own family, my niece has cancer and they were in hospital. And this was so a bit earlier than everyone else. This was this conversation. And I remember laughing at my brother for washing his shopping first week in March. And then 2 weeks later, that wasn't very funny. That was sensible. So we all learned to think about the virus in a different way, I suppose.
Our next door neighbour was washing their shopping bags. Their bags for life, but on their line after every Friday after doing shopping, which was...
Yeah.
Well, with that, Ewen, that was a good idea.
I did that, yeah.
It's Charlie.
Yeah, I think that in terms of what Catherine said, I thought that's really, really interesting, Catherine. I think that I definitely agree with you about the idea of that there's been a huge amount of lay virology. I hadn't thought about that as succinctly as putting it in that phrase, but I absolutely agree with your observation. A lot falls into place for me as soon as you said that. But what I was going to add was that I think that in a very broad and rather crude sense, really, I think that one of the things that's happened, and again, we find ourselves in relatively familiar territory from the heart disease world, apart from anything else, where we get the idea that to ensure adherence, so take from a state public health point of view or an official public health point of view, to ensure adherence to a set of behaviours during the lockdown period, it was very important to the public health project that people felt personally at acute risk. And that because people felt personally at really acute risk, they can then be relied on to stay in, to try and stay away from people and to stay at home and to cut themselves off. Then, of course, we've seen as the weeks have gone by and the months have gone by, then the public health strategy changes, particularly in response to the thing we were talking about first in the discussion, the relationship of the public health ethic to the economic idea. And so we get the idea of opening up, and that people are encouraged to do things, and they're encouraged to do more things, and to begin to take part in society again, and to bring society back to life after the acute phase of avoidance. And I think it is just, it's true, and it's a sort of truism to say that one of the things that is still holding that process up, if that process is desirable to anybody, I'm not saying it's desirable to me, I'm just observing it. One of the things that's holding that up is the fact that the encouragement of making people feel very personally at very strong risk was arguably too successful. And it's taking a very long time for members of the community to shrug that off and realize that this is a public health crisis. It's not a personal health crisis for me. And when people do shrug it off, for example, people who are between the age of 18 and 30 and like to go out to pubs and meet each other and have a good time, then blimey, they're getting a very hard time for doing what is essentially what they've been encouraged to do by the authorities in general. And so I think that we're going to see more of that. And I think that it chimes in with some of the culture war arguments as well, so the whole thing gets really quite mixed up.
It also chimes in with questions of responsibility and responsibilizing citizens and things like that. So Jen, sorry, you want to come in?
That's fine. I'm just, sorry, I'm under a flight path and you might be able to hear it. I'm following from what Charlie said, but also a comment from Esme about respectable discourse and the different elements of lay knowledge that we're talking about. I was just thinking how interesting it is how it ties across different elements where, like that, respectable and non-respectable information they're totally attached. So I was just thinking, I'm just using an example of one person, and it's how, like, their worries of COVID and their lay virology and lay epidemiology interacts with their own life, which they obviously are expert in, like what roles they take on in the community, whether they have a job role or not. But it's also in terms of who they think has value, so their knowledge about value and society and citizenship, layered with their knowledge of themselves and their identity as someone who may or may not be ill. So for example, I know that a pensioner who has an autoimmune disease who doesn't believe themselves to be at risk because they didn't receive a shielding letter from the government. And I was kind of saying, well, I think your illness exists materially, whether the government tells you that you're ill or not. And they were like, but I don't need shield because I'm not. And I was like, that's a really interesting selection, because this person is definitely expert in their own symptoms. They're definitely expert in their own engagement in community, and they're definitely expert in lots of other things because they're, they've lived a life and they're the sort of a strong member of their community, well engaged, big social network. But then they defined their illness and their risk in relation to COVID purely on government information, even when they were quite critical of the government in other ways, when they'd read a newspaper article that said the government's breaking the law, perhaps in a specific and limited way, like that kind of
very small way.
Those combinations of knowledge, like at no point did this person slip entirely out of the realms of respectable knowledge, but at other times you could see quite clearly there were sort of what I saw as gaps in their knowledge. And I think one of the tasks we'll have is like trying to pull apart all those different lay knowledges, because like it's not just like lay knowledge, is it? Not like a lay expert. There's a complicated engagement in all facets of their life that now COVID's kind of pulled together and highlighted in what's a really interesting way. Though I admit that sounds a bit like I'm making intellectual sport of someone's material circumstances, but isn't that academia? Anyway.
Yes, Catherine.
Yeah, I mean, I was very aware that this question of lay virology, everyone had their own approach as a household in that first lockdown. And to some extent that carries on now, like as parents of friends of my children, everyone has slightly different interpretations of this very vague government guidance, right? And different lines that they're drawing, which is complicated to keep track of. But when you're doing the sort of mutual aid food delivery type things, there is a moment when people try and concretize and collectivize a decision about how careful to be, without full knowledge, but in a kind of risk-averse, precautionary sort of way. And some people really reacted against these very rigorous protocols that were developed to manage any sort of infection, and wanted something much looser. But other people felt quite comfortable with having something tied down, and there was a lot of negotiation about, are we using gloves to carry shopping bags? I mean, that was a story in itself for weeks.
Yeah.
Charlie,
I think that definitely that chiming in with both of the stories that we've heard from Catherine and Jen about that these very individual stories about picking up shopping, or indeed Jen's report of a person and the way they might identify themselves. And I think that it does strike very much right at the centre of this constant tension between the individual and the collective, because of course one of the things about a public health crisis, a big collective public health crisis, is that essentially even at the height of the epidemiological crisis, then if you left your house and you walked down the street and you came face to face with another person, statistically speaking, it is actually extremely unlikely that you've got the illness and you're going to give it to them. And it's actually extremely unlikely that they've got the illness and they're going to give it to you on any individual encounter. And yet public health activity demands that both of those individuals become relatively talented actors, and that they both have to act and behave as if they're infectious. That's what we were being asked to do. Every time you encounter another person, please pretend that you're infectious. They will then pretend back to you that they're infectious, and therefore the whole interaction will be successfully distanced. All of that against the background knowledge that actually 99 out of 100 such interactions are entirely theatrical. There's nothing health-wise going on at all, because the virus simply isn't present in that encounter. But of course we know, because we've studied public health collectively between us for several centuries, then well, and individually in my case, but that this idea that that public health activity, public health related activity, does often involve a lot of kind of acting, behaving in a way that you're behaving in that way as a statistical aggregate. You don't actually think that you've got the thing, and so. But it's important that everybody does it, because nobody knows who's got the thing. And again, this is a territory that we know for our pains. We know quite a lot about.
This idea of a theatre, as it being a theatre of illness, works quite well as a segue into our next section, only because there's the theatre of illness and whether you have the virus, and the theatre of performance and performativity. And I guess there's also the standard round of applause, the new currency of the disease, which is we're going to pay frontline staff and key workers in claps rather than money, which is excellent, though I won't be swapping my paycheck for a round of applause. Thank you. Ewen, will you have anything to add to that?
You kind of put me on the spot there, haven't you?
Shall we clap you?
Yeah.
Please don't. Please don't. Yeah, I mean, and does anybody know what happened to all the money that Captain Tom made? Where did it
went to the NHS, into some sort of amorphous NHS. And I think it's all basically he got transmuted into some kind of ideological device. I mean, I think there's also an interesting point about it. On one hand, very excellent to have that money. But on the other hand, it kind of puts down this idea that the NHS can be a charity that people collect money for. I think there's sort of like there's a duality about that particular moment there within it.
So no, we don't know where it went.
We don't know. I was just pointing on the yeah.
Becoming.
Both of those points go back to the kind of to do with a morality or an ethics, including in the terms of avoiding one another. In the way that Charlie kind of described, it becomes obviously kind of an ethical or moral question, and the same with the kind of the applause and veneration in that sense. And I think, but it's interesting in both of those cases where there's a sort of a kind of the distancing oneself from other people becomes a kind of a moral position to take. And I think another couple of people have mentioned about how, I think Karl Mannheim in the 1950s was one of the first people to write about social distancing. In his sense, he saw it as something which the powerful used to kind of shore up their power in this sense, but also in the way that we distance ourselves from things we're kind of scared of or we find repugnant, but also things which we venerate. Whether that's kind of artifacts or kind of important people or religious figures, this kind of thing. They're special and they're kind of over there. And I think that it's interesting in the way that those kind of everyday interactions, which of course always are moral, but it became moral in a slightly different way. But also that we kind of distance ourselves from people that we valued as well. Rather than necessarily the people we were kind of scared of, we valued the older members of our societies or our families or our communities and that kind of thing. And I think that that's just there's an interesting kind of aspect to that, as well as that theatricality. It's that kind of ethicality, I suppose.
You brought the Captain Tom story on, sort of adding to that, and Adrian's comment so well and truly played into the nationalism that's present in the Brexit debate as well. I mean, not only was he venerated as a war vet, a healthy pensioner who was doing his bit for the NHS because taxes and national insurance are not enough, but also the tying up with the Queen, and then it was something very painful about that whole. I found very painful about that whole episode, that whole act. Was very difficult to stomach. I don't know if anyone else had that kind of feeling or had a different sort of response to Captain Tom trailing around his garden. Catherine, and then Charlie, and then Chris.
Yeah, I think it was really weirdly obvious that it was some sort of, I don't know what the opposite of moral panic is, but some sort of collective veneration, wasn't it? And what I found very odd is the way it didn't seem to connect with people's real fears. So I really appreciated Chris's point about the ethicality, that was, it was different than theatre when we were not hugging loved ones, and the pain, the physical experience of that desire to do that and decision not to do that. And I think what was weird about Captain Tom is how it was this older person who was being venerated and celebrated, and yet it somehow didn't seem to connect up at all with these very isolated, in many cases, very isolated older members of our families who were not walking around the gardens because they were terrified or incapacitated, and we were terrified for them. I thought there was something really, really odd about that split. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I was just going to say that a lot of, or several different levels of kind of cultural tradition and managed to come together and get congealed around the one figure, and particularly in terms of the sociology of health and illness, in that he was a perfect figure for the military battle metaphor, because it came just by serendipity, comes at exactly the time that there'd been a lot of commemoration of Dunkirk. It was then a lot of commemoration of 75 years since VE Day, and all of that was at exactly the same time as this perfectly placed veteran who looks just right, and he's got the military title, and that even then, on the odd occasion, because remember that Captain Tom was actually only allowed near the microphone himself to actually have a voice a very small amount of time compared to the media coverage that was the phenomenon of Captain Tom. Then, and of course, as soon as he did get the microphone, then, I mean, it was, frankly, for somebody like me, it was hugely disappointing, because he didn't say anything that he could have said, having had such a voice bestowed on him about the treatment of healthcare staff, about all sorts of things that were going on. He just said, we're definitely going to beat this thing because we're British and that's what we do. All right now, and so everything came together in this kind of perfect storm that makes the last night of the proms look like something hugely progressive. I mean, it was. I found the whole Captain Tom. Jen was said that she found it. I'm not sure what the word that you used was. Painful, I think you said. Well, that doesn't even begin to cover it from my point of view. All right, so, I'm not a Captain Tom fan. I'm quite happy to say that right here, right now.
We'll quote you on it. Chris, do you have something to add?
Yeah, just maybe something. I think there's kind of contradictions in moments like that, where it's not all kind of purely negative. There's something in it, like it's almost like we're going back to that Durkheimian emotional effervescence. You know, when you sort of welling up of emotions that way. I remember when the applause first started, living near the harbour in Aberdeen, it was incredibly powerful because the boats just offshore that go off to the North Sea sounded the foghorns, this incredibly eerie tone, and people applauding, and you felt something, you know, it felt real, you know, standing out the window, clapping hands, watching neighbours, you know, kind of watching it that way. You actually sort of touch and go, yeah, Dirk kind of got that bit right. But, you know, it's like, how do we then sort of like move with that? Who colonizes or codes that emotions, I think is interesting now. And that maybe goes to other people are saying. But I think there was like impulses in this whole pandemic where kind of more kind of progressive or communitarian or different kind of self or community ideas starting to come forward. And that's always an interesting thing about kind of all pandemics. You know, there's a point where it can go one way or the other. You know, things can maybe shift to the right, to left, if you want to use those frameworks. I think if you look at Captain Tom and other aspects of it, there was something there at one point, and then it got transmuted into some other place.
Ewen, did you want to follow
I think that's really interesting, Chris, because there has been, over the course of the lockdown, there's been a very temporal or different temporality to it. So there's been things that have been going on at one stage of lockdown that everybody's thinking, right, yeah, we've got to do this, this is right. And then sort of 4 weeks later, it's almost as if that activity's been forgotten about and everybody's doing something else. And it's been really, I mean, I'm just thinking about it in terms of what's been going on in our own house. We had quizzes and then we were doing this and there's been all these temporal shifts that have gone on all the time. And it's just been really fascinating in a sort of sociological sense in terms of time has been both sort of really constrained, but also opened up sort of simultaneously. Like, and you know, Captain Tom was something that happened, I don't know how long ago it was it happened, but it seems like a very, very long time ago, doesn't it? You know?
Mm-hmm. With just one more thing about the clapping, I think that I've talked to a lot of people about the clapping, and also I've reflected on my own experiences about the clapping. I don't know, those of when we think right back to the beginning of lockdown, if you remember, we were some of the editorial group of Cost of Living blog were posting some brief pictures and things, and I happened to find myself in Spain at the beginning of Spanish lockdown, and I remember we posted on the site film of the applause at 8 o'clock in Spain on the first night of their lockdown, and I found it hugely moving, and then when I got back to England, just in a couple of days later, talking to lots of different people about the issue, then I found that people whose political sensitivities would tend towards the left of centre were finding that they didn't want to go and clap because they felt that the health service was being really badly served by the government, and the individual health workers were being terribly let down. They weren't being protected, they were being allowed to die, they weren't being paid enough, etc. And therefore they thought that it was taking the mickey to go out and clap under those circumstances. They wanted to go out and hold signs saying, I want to pay nurses. I don't want to clap nurses. I want to pay nurses. Then as the weeks went by, then I think a lot of people I'm talking about personal experience. I found myself very much wanting to take part, and I did take part very enthusiastically. And what drew me to that was something that was much more than what Chris was talking about, you know, that was that genuine shiver down the back of the spine when, when you see the community acting together and with a huge expression of togetherness. And it is a really quite an unusual moment, I think, in a mass society, fractured society like our own, when you see that. And I think Chris's description of the foghorns and the moment when you realize that everyone is in this and everyone is participating, that is actually a very special moment, socially and culturally speaking.
In our sort of schedule, this is when we start to interact more with our, is it wrong to call it an audience? Has everyone left? But there are lots of comments down the side that we might want to re-engage with and continue this discussion, but now bringing in these comments. We've had a lot of engagement with Kathy Pope, and there's been some comments. Eleanor's commented and brought it into our working lives in terms of teaching. So does anyone want to pick up any of the discussion in the chat box and keep rolling with it? No, we don't want to talk to anyone. Seems entirely fair. Let's just keep on talking about ourselves.
Sorry, I've been...
I think Kathy's point about the interest in long COVID and whether it was officially recognised, whether that would alter sort of cultural and policy behaviour towards the idea of long COVID. I think that's a really interesting comment. Anyone like to talk to that?
I think long COVID probably fits into a whole category of those various conditions, which there's a problem. It's very problematic for those people who are suffering from them to get recognised that they are actually suffering from something. So I think you could add it into the same. There's a lot of similarities that have been drawn between long COVID and ME, with type of people initially not really believing that people were actually suffering from long COVID. Other people claiming it was only anecdotal evidence that people were suffering from long COVID. But then again, there's an increasing evidence that people are having various problems post-COVID or not really properly recovering from COVID.
Sorry to interrupt you, Simon. Is this referred to as hermeneutic injustice? Have I got that right? When your story isn't, have I just pulled that out of thin air?
I'm not sure.
I'm trying to work out if that's what it's called or not.
It may well.
Someone in the chat, help me out. Hermeneutic injustice.
Epidemiological injustice. I've heard that one. Epistemic injustice.
Oh, yeah, epidemic injustice I've heard of.
Yeah.
Like whether your story is believed when you tell it, and whether you don't tell your story because you presume it won't be believed, or you don't believe your own story. The three sort of pillars. Is that right? Anyway, I interrupted. Carry on.
Yeah, I think that's more or less all I had to say. But yeah.
Thanks, Greg.
Yeah.
And Ross Williams, thank you.
I think that I saw that when we were a few minutes ago, when the chat was scrolling, I saw that somebody, if I could find it, someone called Adrian, Adrian Mercer, has said that it would be interesting to bring in notions of British exceptionalism to the analysis, and I think that's a very, very important point, and that because we're here at a BSA conference, then yes, I think we've all recognised that, and our discussion with Captain Tom and that phenomenon certainly kind of touched on the idea of British exceptionalism, but we've seen it over and over again in official responses and in official plans with our various world-beating apps, and there's been a strong sort of thread of patriotism that runs through the government's discourse and rhetoric about what's going on. What I was wondering was the only other place that I've observed during the pandemic has been Spain, and I would have said that there's a lot of discussion about collectivity, and there's a lot of discussion that is extremely similar to the discussions that go on here about an ineffective government, about lack of preparation, about lack of doing things at the right time. But one of the things that I would say is really lacking from the Spanish situation is an idea of Spanish exceptionalism. I really haven't encountered that. There is no, that I've observed in my observations, that there hasn't been a Spanish Captain Tom figure, and there hasn't been that discourse. But of course, 20th century Spanish history is extremely different and doesn't include things like Dunkirk and the VE Day.
Thanks, Simon, and then Chris.
Obvious reasons.
I was just going to say, I think that exceptionalism was there right from the very start of the pandemic, when other countries were actually explicitly warning us that we needed to get our crap together really quickly, and yet we thought that we didn't need to because we're British, so we could just. And I think that the exceptionalism type of spreads from the top down. It's the very nature of the people who lead our government at the moment. They're all from Eton, where they're actually, I think Danny Dorling talks very well about this, but they're all from Eton, and they're taught basically that they are exceptional, that they're not the same as everyone else, that they're better than everyone else. And that's pretty much what the response was, that we didn't have to worry about this pandemic. We could ride it out because we're British, and it proved to be woefully inadequate, our response, and it shows just how badly let down we were by our exceptionalism.
Yeah, I think, so I'm going to sound like Scotty McNationalist here. I think it's like, there's not maybe a British exceptionalism, it's an English exceptionalism.
Sorry.
One thing it's sort of like shown here is sort of like tensions between the different, so my accent has just got broader. Hello there, no, come on, freedom, you know. But it's just like I think it's exacerbated tensions within the kind of notions of British identity and everything like that. You know, speak to people who are in the Northern Ireland there, it plays out differently than it does here in Scotland. I think the experience is quite different. You know, I mean, you mentioned the kind of the Eton-led leaders, but that's quite contrast with Nicola Sturgeon and her particular presentation she has of herself there. And I think that's another thing, like we've not really touched upon it in this, thank you, discussion, is like the deeper seismic social cleavages and changes that COVID could bring around. You know, and I think that way is something that could sort of like hasten, you know, ideas of what we are as a nation there, moving in different ways. You know, because you look at kind of Sturgeon's kind of popularity has risen through coronavirus, while sort of like Boris Johnson has gone down. I think it's just another kind of a whole other area we could spend time talking about there.
I'm really just saying that we have to be really careful of the time because there's another session immediately after it. So I think we need to, we've got about 2 minutes left, but we absolutely have to finish on time. So I think if there's anyone who wants to make a very quick comment now on, is there anyone who wants to make a quick comment before we wrap up? No, I think just would say, well, thanks a lot for all the panel for taking part. I think it's been a really interesting discussion. If you want to see more about what we've said about COVID collectively or individually, have a look on the blog. There's plenty of great articles up there about COVID, stretching right back from March. But otherwise, just say thanks to everyone for taking part and see you all again maybe next year if we do something like this again.
Hopefully not, yeah. Thank you very much for having me.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks to the audience.
Bye.
Yes, bye everyone.